Well, the question of how Africa can feed itself and how the agricultural sector can be a more effective engine for growth and development have long been a target of international development efforts from Western donors and regained momentum following the 2007-2008 food price crisis. But the emergence of the BRICS as major players has raised hopes that innovative agricultural models and experiments from Brazil or China can be transferred or adapted to African countries. New development practices as well as new partnerships are on the scene. Colin Coleman, partner and managing director of Goldman Sachs, joins us as we unpack the African story just following BRICS. So, Colin, we want an up-to-the-minute update of what BRICS was about and the key themes that you saw unfolding.
Let me say first, I think that South Africa should feel proud to have hosted this BRICS summit, and it certainly was a big thumbs up for South Africa to do so. There are certain people that had high expectations, but I think the realistic outcomes, the two major headlines that came out of the BRICS summit in Durban, one, the creation of the BRICS Business Council chaired by Patrice Motsepe, with South Africa as the first chair of the council having hosted the summit. I think that's an important element because the transmission belt from government policy to actually economic trade and investment is really through the private sector. And we saw through ICBC Standard Bank the sort of corporate investment we can talk about that moves the needle over investment, and we hope to see a lot more of that going into the future. The second important development was the BRICS Development Bank that was announced in principle today. Perhaps there could have been more meat around the bone, but that was to be expected. There's a very complicated mechanism when you set up a bank. You've got to talk about balance sheets, you've got to talk about risk procedures, you've got to talk about management, location, and how they're going to distribute money into projects over the long term. But this is very encouraging, I think, long-term signals for the BRICS, and Africa's position in it is, I think, very, very significant.
Ashraf, any signals for the market out of all the banter happening down in Durban?
I don't think there's any firm signals, but the setting up of the Business Council indicates an intent for more strategic discussions between business and also looking at opportunities across the different sectors. One of the comments that came out of this particular summit is that Russia and South Africa are looking at creating an OPEC-type cartel for platinum. Now, it's certain that our platinum producers here are suffering, but I'm also sure that platinum producers in Russia are suffering similar pains. I mean, they don't have regular electricity. They really have to run off generators most of the time. And I think, those discussions can create some value, but it's not immediate gratification. I think it's going to take some time.
It looks as though some money was put on the table. One of the headlines caught my eye of the daily newspaper saying it's raining BRICS deals. So some money certainly exchanging hands between these emerging countries. Mohammed, your thoughts?
Yeah, in fact, thoughts and maybe a question back to Colin, given that you're down there, is that this really a formalization of businesses in South Africa have really already been exploring relations. So, for example, the most recent deal would have been famous brands exploring India, part of the BRICS. Expansion of companies into China, that's happening. Is this merely the government's playing catch-up, trying to formalize that with better trade relations, trade arrangements? Because I think the deals are already happening behind the scenes. This might formalize it, might even catalyze further deals. But what's the sense you're getting in that respect? Is it government playing catch-up, trying to bring the private sector into the loop here?
I think there is, as I say, a transmission belt between the state and the private sector. I do believe the state actors creating much more support and visible momentum is very important signal to the private sector. So it will accelerate private sector investment. And particularly when it comes to regulatory issues relating to deal making in the mining sector or in the natural resource sector as a whole or consumer. Obviously, the whole regulatory approach, the government approaches to these transactions is very important. To the extent they stand in the way, these deals won't happen. To the extent there is a momentum from the presidents of these countries to get their corporations to support it will be very important. And remember, particularly in China, many of these enterprises are state-owned, majority state-owned enterprises, ICBC a case in point, even though they operate according to market principles, and they certainly will do things that the board of these companies support. But if the government is behind it, it will create much more accelerated momentum.
I was listening to 702 earlier, and there was a discussion happening as to whether the BRICS Development Bank would in fact be placed in South Africa. I know many of us have heard that discussion unfolding. Do you think that in essence is the reality? It could happen?
It could happen, but it's by no means negotiated. Otherwise, we would have seen the announcements today. But I do believe that wherever the domicile is, when you think about where are the projects that the BRICS Development Bank can undertake, many of it is in Africa, because these underdeveloped markets with a huge infrastructure capability, for example, the Inga Dam, which is a several multi-billion-dollar project, needs the momentum of a large balance sheet bank. That doesn't mean the World Bank...
Because it hasn't got off the ground for a long time, if we're talking Inga.
But we need not only finance, but we also need management and technical capability. And I think maybe a difference between a World Bank and something like the BRICS Bank is we'll be able to mobilize not just capital, but also management expertise, technical capability, and the corporations that will deliver these projects. And I think Africa can stand to benefit in many senses, whether Russia is the host, China is the host, or South Africa is the host. Obviously, the South Africans very much wanted to be the host.
I know you're wanting to jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, also just to unpack that, I think the pipeline of projects in Africa, that's certainly very topical, and it's really the last untapped continent from a development perspective. Was there any flavor in terms of sectorally, where would that be focused? I mean, there's a large infrastructural need in terms of a lot of projects that need to get off the ground, but was it resource extractive? Was it focused towards consumer markets? What was the flavor that you got out of the summit?
It is very broad-based, but clearly the governments want to do very specific things, and that is more policy aligned. So, for example, employment creating beneficiation of mineral resources, just as one example. That is clearly something that the South Africans are very much wanting to get behind. The Indians feel that they've got a lot of expertise in the area of manufacturing, and the Chinese are obviously very big in terms of resource extraction, but also in terms of mineral beneficiation experience. And so to the extent they can marry some of these objectives with a private sector market-driven view, it could be quite interesting. But I think there are as many conflicts between what the government wants and the competitiveness of those projects, which are going to have to be worked out. And that might lead to incentives, tax incentives, investment programs, partly which the South African government is already working on. Clearly they want industrialization, they want beneficiation, and they want employment creation. The private sector are looking for return-generating projects that can be executed.
Yeah, the one thing you mentioned is beneficiation, and that's been one of the objectives of the South African government, even the previous government. So for the 30 years that I've read newspapers, it's been a major drive. Obviously, India and China are the front runners on that, and are they going to be prepared to give that up and support South Africa in certain areas, be it in gold, where we're slipping down the ranks, or in platinum production, etc.? What is your sense of that?
Will there be real camaraderie? Let's put it that way.
I think there will, but I worry less actually about the South African capability and more about the non-South Africa capability to deal with that agenda, because it really is about your capability in the negotiations to put your requirements forward. And that is very much the question going forward, is how much are the Africans as a whole going to be able to put their interests forward into the negotiations. I firmly believe, having dealt with the Chinese, for example, extensively, that they are very willing and open to hearing the interests of the African countries and aligning themselves with those interests. But if they don't hear them, they're going to put their own interests forward in their own way, which may be contradictory to the interests of the African countries.
There was another theme that I picked up at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and that was that the African delegations, so to speak, were very much looking at the investment opportunities in Africa in light of the negativity in Europe and saying, well, they're so bad, we're so good. Was there more of that on this stage?
Look, I think generally the theme in the world of the developed markets hitting rough times and hopefully coming out of it, and the developing markets holding up the world, is very much in the minds of the BRICS leaders. So they're riding a wave, and make no doubt about it, Africa is benefiting from that, and South Africa is sailing with a massive wind of these global forces behind it. The question is, what do we do with it? And as a South African citizen and patriot, I'd love to see South Africa taking advantage and making advantage. And this is why there is so much optimism around the BRICS movement and so much attention and interest from South Africa in it, because it could very well be the kind of wind at the back that gets us to commit to the National Development Plan, get the implementation going, and find ourselves making the hard choices to get things moving, which frankly, I think the jury is out on that.
South Africa as a representative for Africa, have we put that discussion to bed, and now do we stand firm as a representative for the continent?
Not at all. I think that is an open, evolving story, and certainly the Nigeria economy, for example, the way it's developing in terms of 7% type economic growth rates, we're at 2.6, struggling towards 3% GDP growth. Nigeria, on all accounts, if it keeps doing the basic things right, should overtake South Africa in terms of size of economy, and that's a natural competition. Hopefully it won't become the BRICS. And hopefully we find that it's a constructive tension rather than a destructive tension. And I think that's what the leadership of President Zuma should strive to achieve, is to strive to achieve a win-win for all African countries, not South Africa wins and Africa loses. And competition is a good thing.
Competition is certainly a good thing. And here's really the question in terms of, do the African countries come together, that cohesion really working in terms of pushing that African agenda, going back to your point of putting Africa's needs on the table appropriately so that they can actually, bat on the same level as the Chinese and Indian counterparts. My worry is that that brinkmanship shouldn't take hold. Nigeria is set to rebase their GDP. That might make them larger than South Africa sometime during the course of this year, depending on what methodology they apply. That really telling me that they're still vying for first position in that space, and I hope that doesn't compromise the investment objective of the continent.
Because if Africa stands together, then we really can force an agenda change.
Absolutely. It's like an African Nations Cup of soccer. Hopefully the championship is a success and everybody comes away feeling, no matter who wins, that we've gained as a continent. But economically, Africa has the wind behind it. There are many investors, many multinational companies, many sovereign wealth funds that want to know how they can invest. The best thing that can happen to Africa is they start to ask themselves, what bankable projects can we put on the table with the right management and the right skills that capital can get behind? And then start to actually execute and show momentum in relation to those projects. There's too much in the past about talking about big projects and not enough detail so that we can actually get them done.
So hopefully this is the start of better execution on all fronts. Colin, thank you so much for your time. Colin Coleman, partner and managing director of Goldman Sachs.